Do you remember when your grandfather could fix just about anything with baling wire and common sense? There was a time in America when being resourceful was not just admired, it was how families survived. Today we are looking at 25 grandpa tricks for getting free electricity that actually worked, and most of them are now completely illegal. Let's start with putting a magnet on the electric meter. This was probably the most widespread trick in rural America from the 1940s through the 1980s. The old analog meters had a spinning aluminum disc inside that turned based on how much electricity flowed through the house. Grandpa figured out that a strong magnet placed against the glass casing would create drag on that disc and slow it down. Some guys used horseshoe magnets from old generators. Others used speaker magnets from broken radios. The utility companies knew it was happening, but with millions of meters across the countryside and only a handful of inspectors, catching someone was nearly impossible. A strong magnet could cut your bill by half. Today it is classified as utility fraud in all 50 states, carrying fines up to $10,000 and even jail time. Modern digital smart meters have tamper detection built right in, but back in 1965, it was practically an open secret in many neighborhoods. The penny in the fuse box. Before circuit breakers became standard in the 1960s, most American homes used screw-in fuses. When a fuse blew, you were supposed to buy a replacement at the hardware store for about 15 cents. But Grandpa had a faster solution. He would unscrew the blown fuse, drop a copper penny into the socket, and screw it back in on top. The penny completed the circuit, and the lights came right back on. The problem is that fuses exist for a reason. They blow when a circuit gets overloaded, preventing the wires inside your walls from overheating. A penny does not blow. It just keeps conducting no matter how much current flows through it. House fires from this trick were disturbingly common throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Insurance investigators learned to check the fuse box first when a home burned down. By the time building codes required circuit breaker panels in new construction, the penny trick had caused untold damage. Today, tampering with your electrical panel without a licensed electrician violates building codes everywhere. Wrapping a blown fuse in aluminum foil. This was the penny trick's slightly more sophisticated cousin. Instead of shoving a coin into the socket, Grandpa would wrap the metal contact on the blown fuse in a piece of aluminum foil from the kitchen and screw it right back in. The foil bridged the gap where the fuse element had melted, restoring the circuit without any overcurrent protection whatsoever. Some guys kept foil right next to the fuse box, as if it were a legitimate electrical supply. Housewives did it too when fuses blew while their husbands were at work. The National Fire Protection Association estimated that improvised fuse repairs contributed to thousands of residential fires per year during the post-war housing boom. When tamper-proof Type S fuses were introduced in the 1970s, they were specifically designed so foil and pennies could not make contact. But by then, most new homes had already switched to breakers. Today, any modification to a fuse box is a code violation in every jurisdiction in the country. Earth batteries. This one sounds like science fiction, but it was real. An earth battery uses two different metals, usually copper and zinc rods, buried in damp soil a few feet apart. The chemical reaction between the metals and the minerals in the soil produces a small but genuine electrical voltage. The concept was patented in the 1840s and was actually used to power early telegraph lines across frontier territory where stringing wire was impractical. By the early 1900s, resourceful farmers were building banks of earth batteries to charge accumulators and run crystal radios. A single pair might produce half a volt, but wired in series, you could get usable current. For folks living miles from the nearest power line, it was genuine free electricity pulled right from the ground. Today, you cannot legally connect any homemade power source to the grid, and using one in place of code-compliant wiring violates every electrical code on the books. The earth battery is not illegal to build, but powering a home with one certainly is. Before we move on, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're enjoying this trip down memory lane, a like and a subscribe truly helps us continue making these videos for you. We really appreciate it. Homemade windmills from old car parts. During the Great Depression and well into the 1950s, farm families across the Great Plains built wind-powered generators from whatever they could scrounge. The typical design used a car generator, handmade wooden blades, and a tail vane cut from sheet metal, all mounted on a tall pole or the barn roof. A wire ran down to old car batteries, and suddenly you had juice for a radio, a few lights, and maybe a water pump. Companies like Jacobs Wind Electric sold commercial versions, but many families could not afford those and built their own. These rigs were not pretty and not safe by any modern standard, but they worked. When the Rural Electrification Administration strung power lines to remote farms in the 1940s and 1950s, most backyard windmills came down. Today, putting up any wind turbine requires permits, engineering certifications, zoning approval, and an interconnection agreement with the utility company. Bolting a car alternator to a pole in your yard would violate half a dozen regulations. Damming up the creek for a water wheel. If you had a creek running through your property, Grandpa saw free electricity just flowing right past the house. Across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the rural Northwest, families built small dams and water wheels to generate power. Some used old mill designs that had been around for centuries. Others rigged car generators next to homemade turbines. The beauty of water power is that it runs 24 hours a day, unlike wind. A decent creek with a few feet of drop could produce enough electricity for an entire small farmhouse. Some setups operated for decades with almost no maintenance. But today, damming any waterway requires permits from your state environmental agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, and often the EPA. You also need Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approval for hydroelectric power, even on your own land, even from a tiny creek. What Grandpa did in an afternoon with rocks and lumber would now take years of paperwork and thousands in legal fees. Running the meter backward. Here is one that utility companies absolutely hated. The old analog meters could actually spin in both directions. If you fed electricity back into your house wiring from a generator or batteries charged by a windmill, the disk would spin backward, subtracting from your usage. Some clever folks ran a small gasoline generator during peak rate hours and literally made their meter go backward, wiping out whatever they had racked up during the month. The utility man would come to read the meter and scratch his head, wondering how a 4-bedroom house used almost no electricity. Others discovered that certain motor and capacitor configurations confused the meter into counting backward while electricity was actually being consumed. Utility companies redesigned meters with ratchets preventing reverse spinning, but that did not happen everywhere at the same time. In some rural areas, reversible meters stayed in service into the 1990s. Today, net metering programs let you get credit for approved solar panels, but doing it through unauthorized means is a felony in most states. Hooking up before the meter. This was the boldest trick on the list. The electric line comes from the pole to your house, passing through the meter before reaching your breaker panel. But what if you tapped into that line before the meter? Everything pulled from that tap was completely unmetered and free. Linemen who moonlighted would sometimes install a hidden tap for cash. Others did it themselves, running a concealed wire from the service entrance cable before the meter box, then burying it underground to a workshop or barn. The risks were enormous. You were working with live, unprotected power straight from the transformer. People were electrocuted doing this, and those who survived often carried the burn scars for life. But for someone struggling to keep the lights on during hard times, the temptation was powerful and real. Utility companies started using tamper-evident seals and periodic inspections specifically because this was so widespread. Today, it is prosecuted as theft of services and can carry prison time. Wood gasifier generators. During World War II, when gasoline was rationed, people converted vehicles and generators to run on wood gas. A gasifier heats wood in a low-oxygen environment, producing flammable gas that powers an internal combustion engine. The technology was widely used in Europe during the war, and plenty of Americans built their own. After the war, some rural families kept gasifiers running because free fuel from the woodlot beat buying gasoline. You could take a 50-gallon drum, fill it with wood chips, light it with restricted airflow, and pipe the gas into any engine with minor carburetor modifications. In the 1970s energy crisis, interest in wood gasifiers surged again. Mother Earth News published plans that thousands built from. Today, operating an unregistered generator connected to home wiring without permits violates electrical codes, and wood gasifier emissions run afoul of EPA clean air regulations in most areas. Stealing a trickle from the telephone lines. The old copper telephone lines carried around 48 volts DC when idle and up to 90 volts when ringing. Not a lot of power, but enough to run small devices. Tinkerers tapped the phone line, ran current through a voltage regulator, and used it to charge batteries or power a radio. The telephone company paid for the electricity keeping those lines energized and had no way of knowing someone was siphoning a tiny fraction. In very remote areas where homes had phone service but no electricity, this was sometimes the only source of power without a generator. Some old-timers reportedly ran small radios for years on nothing but telephone line current, and the phone company never knew the difference. The amounts were so small it rarely caused problems and was almost never prosecuted. Today, with the old copper network being replaced by fiber optics, the trick would not even work anymore. And tapping into any communications line is a federal offense under the Telecommunications Act. Running an extension cord to a public outlet. This was less a grandpa trick and more a universal survival strategy. Parks, public restrooms, gas stations, fairgrounds, anywhere with an accessible outlet, someone was plugging in. During the Depression, families living in their cars ran cords from public outlets to power a light bulb or hot plate. In the 1960s and 1970s, campers ran cords from the bathhouse to their tents. Construction workers plugged personal tools into outlets on job sites that were not theirs. It was so widespread that property owners started putting locks on outdoor outlets. Even into the 1990s, people ran cords from church outlets and laundromat exteriors. Some apartment dwellers were known to drop extension cords out windows and down to the laundry room outlets in the basement. Today, plugging into any outlet without permission is theft of electricity, and commercial properties can and do prosecute. Those locked outlet covers you see everywhere are a direct legacy of this once common practice. Which of these tricks did your grandfather actually use? We would love to hear your stories in the comments. Crystal radios and harvesting radio waves. The crystal radio required zero electricity to operate. It used energy from radio waves to power a tiny earpiece. All you needed was a coil of wire, a crystal detector, a long antenna, and a good ground connection. Radio waves hitting the antenna provided just enough energy to produce audible sound. No batteries, no plug. Millions of Americans built crystal radios as kids in the 1940s and 1950s from plans in Boy Scout handbooks and Popular Mechanics. But some tinkerers went further, building large antenna arrays to harvest as much radio frequency energy as possible, then rectifying it into DC current for batteries or small lights. These setups actually worked, pulling free electricity out of thin air. It was not much, but it was real, and it came from nowhere visible. The idea that you could light a bulb with nothing but an antenna still feels like magic. Today, the FCC strictly regulates anything connected to an antenna, and deliberately harvesting RF energy from commercial broadcasts falls into a gray area that most lawyers say violates federal communications law. Thermoelectric power from the wood stove. If Grandpa heated with a wood stove or coal stove, he was sitting next to a potential power source. Thermoelectric generators use a principle called the Seebeck effect. Place two different metals together, heat one side and cool the other, and voltage is produced. Tinkerers built devices by stacking metal pairs, placing one end against the hot stovepipe and letting the other extend into cool room air. One pair produced tiny voltage, but wired in series you could run a radio or charge batteries. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union mass-produced thermoelectric generators for remote Siberian villages. In America, it was more of a hobbyist pursuit, but it was real and it worked. Today, the technology is legal to experiment with, but connecting any homemade power source to household wiring without a licensed electrician and permits is a code violation. And wood stoves themselves now require permits and inspections in most places. Black garden hose, solar water heater. This was one of Grandpa's simplest tricks, and nearly every suburban kid before 1990 experienced it. Take a long black garden hose, coil it on the roof or a sunny patch of ground, connect it to the water supply, and wait. The black hose absorbs solar radiation, and the water gets genuinely hot. Some families ran 100 feet across their roof and plumbed it into the house to preheat water before the water heater, cutting their bill significantly. Water from one of these rigs on a July afternoon in Texas could easily hit 140 degrees. Commercial solar water heaters existed since the early 1900s, but the garden hose version was the poor man's alternative and remarkably effective. Today, installing any solar thermal system requires building permits, plumbing permits, and in many HOA neighborhoods, architectural approval. Even laying hose on your roof can trigger a violation notice faster than you can say, free hot water. A lawnmower engine hooked to a car alternator. When the power went out, Grandpa did not buy an expensive portable generator. He built one. Take a lawnmower engine, mount it to plywood, and belt drive it to a car alternator. The engine turns the alternator, producing 12-volt DC power for a battery or 12-volt appliances. With an inverter, you could run household appliances too. Guys built these all over America from the 1950s through the 1990s. Engines came from junked mowers and tillers, alternators from junked cars. Total cost might be $20 in scrap and one afternoon of tinkering. They were loud and vibrated like crazy, but they absolutely worked. Some guys got so good at building them that neighbors would come over during storms to borrow power, running extension cords across the yard from Grandpa's homemade rig. Today, building your own generator is not illegal, but connecting it to house wiring without a transfer switch installed by a licensed electrician is a serious code violation and potentially deadly to utility linemen working on what they believe are deadlines. Rigging a bicycle to a generator. During the 1970s energy crisis, bicycle generators appeared in countless homesteading guides. Put a bicycle on a stand so the rear wheel spins freely, press a small generator against the tire, and pedal. A healthy adult could produce 75 to 100 watts, enough for light bulbs, battery charging, or a radio. Some families set these up as primary charging stations for off-grid battery banks. Kids were recruited for pedaling shifts, and more than a few grandchildren have stories about earning their television time one pedal stroke at a time. It sounds primitive, but the math works, and the exercise was a bonus. Today, building one is legal, but using it as your sole power source in a municipality with mandatory utility connection ordinances can put you in violation of housing codes. Several off-grid families have been taken to court over exactly this issue in recent years. Imagine that. Pedaling a bicycle in your own home and a judge tells you it is against the law. piggybacking off the barn meter. On farms with multiple buildings and separate electrical services, a common trick was running power from one meter to another building. The barn often carried a cheaper agricultural rate, sometimes less than half the residential price. Grandpa would run underground cable from the barn panel to the house, powering it on the agricultural meter while the house meter barely moved. Some farmers disconnected the house meter entirely. Utility companies eventually caught on and started doing load analysis. If a chicken farm with 50 birds was pulling enough power for a 4-bedroom house, that raised red flags fast. Some even ran the wire through old drainage tiles or irrigation pipes so no one could spot a fresh trench. The savings over a year could amount to hundreds of dollars, a fortune for a family barely getting by. Today, using an agricultural rate for residential purposes is considered rate fraud and can result in backbilling for years of underpayment, steep fines, and immediate termination of service. Utility investigators now use thermal imaging and smart meter analytics to catch exactly this kind of arrangement. Compost pile water heater. A large compost pile generates tremendous heat as organic material decomposes. The center can easily reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit and maintain that temperature for weeks. Grandpa's version was simple. Build a large pile around a coil of pipe, run water through it, and the compost heats the water. Some families ran hundreds of feet of pipe through massive piles and produced enough hot water for showers, dishes, and laundry without electricity or gas. The most ambitious systems captured methane gas for cooking too. Jean Pain perfected the technique in France in the 1970s, but Americans had used the basic principle for decades. The beauty was turning waste, leaves, grass clippings, manure, and kitchen scraps into genuinely usable energy that cost absolutely nothing. Your garbage kept your family in hot water. Today, large-scale composting requires permits in most jurisdictions. Capturing methane means compliance with environmental regulations. Running homemade hot water into your plumbing without permits and backflow prevention devices violates codes everywhere. Living off 12-volt car batteries. Before rural electrification reached every corner of America, running your home on car batteries was surprisingly common. Acquire a few batteries, charge them with a windmill or by taking them to a gas station, then wire 12-volt lights and a radio throughout the house. Sears catalog sold 12-volt household fixtures for this market well into the 1960s. Some families lived this way for decades. The batteries needed periodic replacing, and the lead-acid fumes were not great, but it worked. In remote parts of Alaska, Montana, and the Southwest, 12-volt homesteads persisted into the 1990s, and a handful still exist today. The people who lived this way knew more about electricity and conservation than most modern homeowners ever will. They could tell you exactly how many amp hours it took to run a light for an evening. Today, most municipalities have habitability codes requiring grid connection or code-compliant alternatives. Running car batteries in your living room does not meet those standards and can result in your home being declared unfit for habitation. Of all these tricks, which one surprises you the most? Let us know in the comments. Gravity-fed micro-hydro from a hillside spring. If Grandpa had a spring on a hillside, he had a potential power plant. Water flows downhill, capture it in a pipe, aim it at a turbine, and convert that to electricity. Families in mountainous regions built micro-hydro systems from plumbing parts and junkyard generators. A spring at just a few gallons per minute with 50 feet of elevation drop could power lights, a refrigerator, and a radio around the clock. Unlike wind and solar, a spring runs continuously, day and night, rain or shine. Some of these installations were remarkably well engineered and operated for decades with minimal maintenance. A good spring never quit on you the way a windmill did on a calm day or a gasifier did when you ran out of wood. But today, diverting water from any natural source, even a spring on your own property, requires water rights permits in most western states. Building anything in a waterway triggers environmental review, and connecting a homemade generating system to your home requires electrical permits and an interconnection agreement with the power company. Doing all your own electrical work. There was a time when a man was expected to handle his own wiring the same way he fixed his car and built his fence. Grandpa did not call an electrician to add an outlet or wire a new room. He bought Romex and a box of outlets and did it on Saturday afternoon. No permits, no inspections. For most of the 20th century, nothing stopped a homeowner from doing any electrical work they wanted. Most did competent work learned from their fathers and uncles, men who understood how circuits worked because they had wired houses from scratch during the building booms of the post-war years. But some did terrifying things that home inspectors still find today. Junction boxes with no covers, wire spliced with tape, 14-gauge wire on 30-amp circuits. Beginning in the 1970s, states began requiring permits and inspections for electrical work. Today, in many jurisdictions, even changing a light switch technically requires a permit, and any significant work must be done by or inspected by a licensed electrician. Burying your own power line to an outbuilding. Need electricity in the barn or workshop? Grandpa bought a roll of direct burial cable, dug a trench with a shovel, laid the wire in, and covered it up. Done by lunchtime. He might bury it 6 inches or 2 feet deep, depending on the soil. In the best cases, he used proper underground rated cable. In the worst cases, he ran indoor Romex barely covered with dirt. Either way, the outbuilding had power by supper. Underground lines installed this way have been found for decades, often when a contractor hit them with a backhoe. Some of these bootleg cables were found still energized and carrying current 30 or 40 years after Grandpa buried them, the insulation crumbling and the bare copper touching damp soil. It is a miracle more people were not killed. Today, underground electrical work requires a permit, inspection, proper depth according to code, ground fault protection, and a call to the utility to mark existing lines before digging. What Grandpa did in 4 hours now takes 4 weeks of paperwork and several $1,000s in contractor fees. Rigging a homemade arc welder from scrap. Not exactly free electricity, but a trick that let Grandpa pull enormous power from outlets never designed for it. A homemade arc welder can be built from a large transformer, salvaged from a microwave oven or industrial equipment. Rewind the secondary coil with heavy copper wire for low voltage at very high amperage. Plug it into a wall outlet, and you can weld steel. The problem is, it can pull 40 or 50 amps through a circuit rated for 15. The wiring in the walls heats up. The breaker should trip, but sometimes does not. Factory welders have duty cycles and safety features. Grandpa's scrap welder had none. It ran until something melted or caught fire. These were everywhere in rural America, and many farm shops still have one collecting dust in the corner. Ask around at any farm auction, and someone will have a story about one. Building and using one today violates electrical safety codes and almost certainly voids your homeowner's insurance if anything goes wrong. Using abandoned well gas for free fuel. In oil country from Pennsylvania to Texas to California, old abandoned wells sometimes seep natural gas for decades after operations cease. Farmers who had these on their property would cap them with a pipe fitting and run a line to the house. Free natural gas for heating, cooking, and for running generators that made electricity. In Appalachia, families tapped gas seeps since the 1800s, long before the commercial gas industry existed. Some homes ran on free well gas for generations, never paying a dime for heating fuel, while their neighbors wrote checks to the gas company every single month. The gas was not always pure. It sometimes contained hydrogen sulfide and other dangerous compounds, but it burned, it was free, and it kept the house warm all winter long. Today, abandoned wells are regulated by state oil and gas commissions. Tapping one without permits, safety equipment, and environmental assessments violates state and federal law. The EPA classifies them as hazards, and property owners must report rather than use them. Building a backyard steam engine. This was the ultimate grandpa project. A steam engine converts heat from any fuel into mechanical power that drives a generator. Burn wood, coal, or corn cobs, boil water, and use steam pressure to turn a piston. Small steam engines were commercially available into the early 1900s. After falling from common use, hobbyists kept the tradition alive, building their own or restoring antiques. A well-built unit on a wood fire can produce several kilowatts, more than enough for a house. The knowledge passed through families and mechanics clubs, later through magazines like Live Steam. There were men in every county who could look at a piece of scrap iron and see a working boiler in it. Today, operating a steam boiler requires pressure vessel certification, annual inspections, and ASME compliance. Building an unlicensed boiler is illegal in every state, for good reason. Improperly built, a steam boiler is essentially a bomb. But Grandpa built them anyway, and more often than not, they worked just fine. Thanks for joining us on this trip down memory lane. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and share it with a friend who remembers when free electricity was just a little ingenuity away. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss another video.